Hey friends, thanks for joining us. I have a very special guest on the line. It's Hatrick Penry. You guys would know him from his YouTube channel and his work on Fukushima. The YouTube channel is Hatrick Penry. Hatrick, thanks for taking the time to meet with us.
I appreciate it, man. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for the opportunity.
Well, it's my pleasure. At SGT Report, all we care about is trying to get to the core of the truth. And we've been on the Fukushima story since the day that tsunami and earthquake devastated Japan. So much has transpired since then. It's hard to really know what truthfully has transpired and how bad the situation is. I had Helen Caldicott on the program February 13th, and about midway through that interview, I brought your name up. And first, so everybody knows, Helen, I think, is on the side of truth. I'm just not sure how well-versed she is in your work. And according to Helen, at this point, there is, quote, no best-case scenario for Fukushima, just worsening degrees of horror because it's scientifically impossible to clean up what has already occurred. And with thousands of spent fuel rods and thousands more active fuel rods still in the fuel pools of the damaged reactor buildings, the worst-case scenario, if another major earthquake were to hit the area, is potentially an ecological nightmare of biblical proportions for everyone living in the Northern Hemisphere. And I wanted to invite Hatrick onto the show here to address the FOIA documents that he's found, to address all of his research the best we can in, a half hour here. I want to start by playing this exchange between Helen and I, just to set the stage as to why we wanted to have Hatrick Penry on. Do you think we would ever know the truth of what's going on there? And the reason I ask is because we've seen coverage in the national news media here in the United States from ABC News and others that take video cameras in, saying that they're being given exclusive access to number 4 in the removal of the fuel rods, which is said to have begun. And what we see in the video being shared here in America is a pristine interior building. It doesn't look like a building in which the top blew off in a hydrogen explosion. There are many out there, like Hatrick Penry. I sent you a PDF document, a 445-page PDF document called Plumegate. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to look at that. But there are many that have looked at the Freedom of Information Act documents.
I've read it.
Okay, what's your take? Can we believe anything coming out of Japan, out of TEPCO, or out of the American news media?
Yes, and I think Patrick Hendrick goes too far, and I don't agree with some of the stuff he says. You've got to be really up to date with your facts.
So Hatrick Penry, thanks so much for joining us. We really do appreciate it. I spoke with Helen Caldicott. I brought your name up to her. She said she had read your 445-page PDF called Plumegate. I've only gotten through about 180 pages of it, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to take the stage. Where would you like to begin? You want to begin with the explosions of reactors 3 and 4, or you start wherever you want?
I'll be happy to discuss Units 3 and Units 4, and specifically what I talk about and what I have knowledge of are the instances what happened to these spent fuel pools. Early on in these documents, it's very clear that the damage was catastrophic to the spent fuel pools. In the case of Unit 3, you can see HD pictures online if you dig around, and you can visibly see there's no walls on the spent fuel pool. On Unit 4, they discuss a crack and the drainage of the coolant from the spent fuel pool. And at some point, it's like any of these initial events, you can get a lot of truth out of what initially comes out. At some point in these documents, TEPCO begins to give the NRC a hard time, and they want them to recant and say there is water in Unit 4 in the spent fuel pool. And the point being with these documents is there's a mountain of evidence well past 5, 6, 7, 8 days where they're still worried that the spent fuel of Unit 4, they know it's melted down, and they're running calculations, naval reactors and NRC, to find out, is that hot corium blob of the spent fuel going to sublimate through the floor of the spent fuel pool? And there's a back and forth in another section of doc. They're worried about it melting through down to the torus below. So the concern, even as far as the 21st of March 2011, centered around the Unit 4 spent fuel pool, and did that melted fuel burn through the bottom of the spent fuel pool? So what's important about my book and the abstract I have out now that I would implore Helen Caldicott to dig deep into is just this massive amount of evidence that stands in stark contrast to the official story. And I don't want to fearmonger either, but I suspect that the evidence indicates that the worst of the worst, a true worst case scenario, meaning, and this was also shown in President's worst case scenario he called for, that was a model that was run on 3 reactor meltdowns and 4 spent fuel pool meltdowns. And that would be the logical conclusion to a complete loss of power, and earthquake and tsunami damage, saltwater inundation of electrical components. Even if you had brought power back by some magical means, you'd have still had damaged circuitry and other electronics that would be damaged by salt water. So you see there was no easy fix. It was a worst case scenario, and they knew that early on. And I might add briefly, it wasn't just this 72-hour quote unquote fog of war type situation where they say, hey, we got it wrong, we made an honest mistake. I've shown in the documents that Jennifer Uhl is still having back and forth discussions with naval reactors about, is the spent fuel going to sublimate through the concrete? So they were still, weeks into it, concerned with that Unit 4. And Unit 3 is kind of not as much info in there, but I might say it. We know it had MOX fuel. And we know the Canadians were concerned in a part of these documents where they say, hey, you guys didn't calculate for your dose rates for Unit 3 the fact it had MOX fuel in it. And they wanted the NRC to redo their calculations. And the guy says, we'll discuss it later in a phone call. So I don't know if they ever did that. But that's a summation of Units 3 and 4 for you right there.
Now, the point I was trying to make to Helen, and I wanted her opinion on it because I do respect her as a scientist, and she is studied in this area. But even as a layman like I am, it seems to me that based on the video of the explosions of Unit 3 and then the really massive explosion of Unit 4, that was the larger explosion, wasn't it, Hatrick?
That's difficult for me to say. I haven't really taken the time to compare. I've seen both videos kind of separately, and either one, like you're saying, it is a massive concussive force that in these documents they say particles of fuel pellets have been blown out of Unit 4 and Unit 3 and are spread across the ground of the facility. They mention dose rates between 3 and 4, 500 rem an hour. So we can clearly see in these documents that, like you say, visually we see the explosion, and then confirmed in these documents just the damage is absolutely catastrophic.
And even more so if you understand that these GE plants, this model of plant is the type of plant in which spent fuel rods are stored on top of the reactor building. And if the building's blow sky high, then you'd have to surmise that all of those spent fuel rods also blew up and are unrecoverable and have spewed endless amounts of radiation into the environment and potentially into the ocean. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, or would you prefer to talk about the fuel pools? Because that was my other question for Helen, is when we see on television, ABC News or others, getting exclusive access
Right.
to these buildings, which appear to be pristine on the inside, I don't think that adds up. That does not look possible to me. That looks like different reactor buildings than 3 or 4. What's your take on that?
Well, the possibility certainly exists. We know there's a Unit 5 and Unit 6 that did not suffer the same amount of damage as the others. Again, information is sketchy and we don't know who to believe 100%, but is it not possible they are filming there down at Diani, another facility south of Fukushima, that maybe suffered damage, and they'll show you the spent fuel pool and you can see some debris, a little bit of cloudiness. But that's not the same spent fuel pool indicated in these documents and the conditions in these documents. And might I add, a number of NRC officials did not recant their story to my knowledge. Chuck Castro, John Moniger, a couple of these guys, to my knowledge, have not recanted their initial assessment. I've never seen in these documents them come back and change it. It's Jaxco that came back initially, stood before Congress and said the spent fuel pool was dry, according to what I read in these documents. Anyway, I haven't seen that film footage of him in Congress, but apparently he said, yes, it was dry. Then they recanted when TEPCO put pressure on them, and I'm sure our government put pressure too, and then came the flip-flop that the pool has water in it. We made an honest mistake. But again, in these documents, I show many weeks in, they're still concerned about the heat up in Unit 4 and did it sublimate through the concrete. And so I might add that in a public meeting in California in September of 2013, NRC official Jennifer Uhl, U-H-L-E is how you spell her last name, she's stating to the public that there was no spent fuel pool heat up in any of the pools affected at Fukushima, which is just, it's jaw dropping, because in these documents that flies in the face of everything that is shown in these NRC FOIA documents, which are free and publicly available. Anyone can dig around in there and read this stuff.
Well, and that's what you've done, and that's why we wanted to get you on. We want to spread the word and encourage people to take a look at your new abstract, which is a revised, it's really a cut down of your 445-page PDF document called Plumegate, and it's just a massive amount of work. This citizen journalism movement that's happening, that has really been sparked by guys like Luke Rudkowski at We Are Change. We see Ben Swan having so much success sinking his teeth into the alternative media. What you are doing and what you have done is you have collected these FOIA documents and put them in one place so that people can read them and people can have access to the truth. And that's why I think your work's important, and I wanted to get you on. Let's talk now just a little bit about the removal of the fuel rods from the fuel pools. Even if there's water in the pools of 3 and 4, let's assume they haven't suffered a great deal of damage. I believe they have. Let's say they haven't. I think it was Arnie Gunderson who made the point that if you imagine those rods being just millimeters apart, imagine a damaged pack of cigarettes. And if just the bottom part is crinked, if any of those rods are crinked anywhere, they can't be removed. They can't be pulled out safely. And what is your take on the removal of these fuel rods? Have you been following the news? Do you think it's happening? Do you think it's even possible?
Well, again, I'm very skeptical, and I would just compare solar power to nuclear power. I read an article the other day where a small town has basically most of the houses anyway have solar power. This town is producing enough energy via solar power that they're selling it back to the utility companies, so they have energy and they're also making money from it. And if you look at examples like that, if you look at some of these reports, I believe the Union of Concerned Scientists did a report where they said over 5,000 patents are being suppressed in the United States. Solar cells with 80% or greater efficiency, they can seize the patents or hold the patents. And so if you look at that, and then you look at nuclear power and say, just the fact you're telling me that they have this delicate operation to pull these most dangerous rods out, in the circumstances, the environment surrounding that situation is so precision oriented and so razor edge difficult and dangerous. This is simply flies in the face of all logic that we would use nuclear as a means of energy production. It's a very dangerous a way of producing power, as Einstein said, a hell of a way to boil water. And Fukushima proves beyond any reasonable doubt that a worst case scenario is possible, and there can be a multiple criticalities, not just one like in Chernobyl. We can have 3 reactors, 4 spent fuel pools. It flies in the face of all logic to use this as a means of energy production, except for the fact that it is an energy monopoly. Hence, you or I cannot build a nuclear reactor in our backyard and produce power via that means. However, we can install solar panels. I read another article, you can spray this paint on the outside of your house, hook up your electrodes, and the paint is like a solar cell energy production means. So it just boggles my mind. Other than nuclear weapons and the monopoly, there's no reason for anyone, and I'm against nuclear weapons and I'm against energy monopolies, but that's my logic why this archaic means of power continues.
Yeah, it boggles my mind too. I often share with people at work in an attempt to kind of, jog their curiosity a little bit. I'll say, don't you find it interesting that supposedly we went to the moon back in the late 60s and early 70s, and we haven't been back since? But meanwhile, you have an iPhone in your pocket that has more computing power than the machines that filled rooms that sent those men to the moon. The technology is there to free humanity, and sadly, this monopoly of which you speak is the name of the game. It's the oligarch's monopoly, be it the monetary monopoly or the technology monopoly. What's happened to the trillions and trillions of dollars missing from the Pentagon? Where did that money go? What happened?
I'm told Donald Rumsfeld is on the case of that, and as soon as he finds it, he's going to turn it in.
Yeah, he's the same. Yeah, he's hot on the trail, just like OJ's hot on the trail of his wife's killer.
Exactly. I want to add, if I could, real quick. A minute ago we talked about the the control of energy and so on and so forth, but the control of information. If you look in these documents, these guys admit they know about the reality of Chernobyl. Now, publicly, officials will tell you, and IAEA, I think, has a statement that 49, 50 people died in Chernobyl. Well, that's technically accurate in the explosion, initial blast or whatever, people died subsequently. Now, as a result of fallout, some studies show well over a million have died as a result of fallout and cancers and so on and so forth. In these documents, I have a screen capture where a guy is talking about that. He says, well, what about how many people died from Chernobyl? And someone pipes in and says, well, 49. And there's a lot of inaudible parts on this section conveniently, but you can see the thrust of the conversation. They're kicking back and forth that 49 number. They know it's not right. And the guy says, but what about cancer and so on and so forth? And those numbers are in parentheses inaudible where we can't see them, but you can see that the thrust of the conversation is they know a lot more has died from Chernobyl than they will publicly admit. And so that's one of the things you can glean from these documents, just as you can look in the documents and say, hey, publicly they say potassium iodine is not a big deal to have. There's a meltdown, don't worry about it. It only protects you from radioactive iodine. In these documents, there's nobody going to Japan without their potassium iodine. In one instant, I think it was Chuck Castro, who was the lead member of NRC responding to Fukushima. He forgot his potassium iodine, his Ki, and they said, ship him some immediately. There was 1 million tablets purchased, I think, through Amex and shipped to Japan. So there's distribution of potassium iodine in Japan to military, to civilians. There's a massive amount of potassium being handed out to people. So whilst on the one hand they say it's not a big deal in these documents, man, I tell you what, they're very deceptive, and they're not honest with the American public at all about nuclear power on all fronts.
And we know that the radiation coming off of Fukushima is real. We know it for a fact quantifiably because of the sailors injured on the USS Reagan. I mean, they went in for a rescue operation and they were hit with plume. They were hit with radioactive snow, which was really steam, essentially radioactive snow that hit the deck of that ship. And many, many, many of those sailors are now suffering from all forms of severe cancers, and many of them are dying.
Well, found in these documents, which was jaw-dropping for me, and this has been a whole nother awakening for me when I read these documents, there's clear indication that the Admiral Willard, Admiral Donald, the Navy reactors, NRC, they knew of repeated plumes. They knew it was a prolonged station blackout. They knew the helicopter water drops are ineffective, and yet they still sailed Navy ships into the plumes, into Japan. They had the Operation Tomodachi, where the Army sent in their chemical crew to do checks as people came into the Misawa Air Base and the Yokota Air Base. I read the documents on those. They're not FOIA documents, but this is what the Army released. In those documents, they state that the guys checking for radiation for vehicles returning into the military base and so on and so forth, their level of protection, protective gear, was based on a need not to alarm civilians. So they wore rubber gloves. And there's a statement, the guy says, he's asking one of these technicians, if the radiation's so bad, why are you wearing just rubber gloves? And the technician says, look, you have civilians on your plane. We do not want to alarm civilians. So this is the callous disregard for the health and the lives of our sailors and our Army personnel to send them in these circumstances and situations when clearly in these documents, they knew they should. You know what I would have done is sailed them around the world if necessary. I just said gas up in Iraq. We got plenty of oil in Afghanistan. Sail them into the winds because we have to react on what a possible worst case could be. They had that information, and yet for some reason they sail them right into the plumes. And I suspect it's just because if they had reacted the way they should have, sailed ships out of the way, tried to make a lead sarcophagi and pour lead into these things, the world would have seen this and known just how bad the situation was and the truth about nuclear power. Their reaction to this catastrophe was based on a need not to alarm the world and show the true reality of nuclear power. That's the darndest thing about it.
Yeah, on that point, we see patterns. And we follow patterns. We see patterns time and time again coming out of governments in general, false flag patterns. We see, for instance, on 9/11, the EPA made the statement that the air was clean and safe for the first responders when they knew full well that the air was filled with arsenic and lead and all sorts of poisons. And all of those 9/11 first responders, so many of them have died, have since died, and have become very, very ill. And so we see these patterns again. It doesn't again and again, and it doesn't surprise me that the USS Ronald Reagan went into the plumes and put these sailors at risk. It's shocking, but yet it's not surprising. And actually, on that topic of patterns, let me ask you something. You have, right at the top of your YouTube channel, you have a phrase from one of these documents that you pulled from, and it says, if you have participated in the, quote, Japan earthquake and tsunami drill, end quote, that began today, Friday, March 11th, 2011, please be sure to apply your spent time on this activity to the TAC number listed below. Do you want to flush that out for us, Hatrick, and give us your thoughts on that? And I guess what I'm driving at is a couple of things. I'll show my cards here. There was a seismic event on March 11th off the coast of Japan. If we look at the buildings as the waves are coming in, none of the buildings appear to be damaged. So I just want to ask you about that document that you uncovered that quotes a Japan earthquake and tsunami drill, and then you take it from there. What are your thoughts on anything I've just said?
Okay, there's actually a couple of documents that hint at this earthquake and tsunami drill that was apparently conducted on the same day and at the same time as the actual event went down. Now, this is quite disturbing and should be front and center in all alternative media outlets right now, because in a presentation I do on a YouTube video, I go back to the Vigilant Guardian drill prior to 9/11.
That's right.
I talk about it would have been a hurricane drill that Southcom did in South Florida prior to day before the Haiti earthquake. You have the London 7/7 drill with the train bombings. You have an Oklahoma a bombing drill. You have the Aurora drill. You have the Oslo drill, the Texas plant explosion fertilizer. Okay, so we see, as you said, patterns.
Well, and if I may, I want to jump on and piggyback on to 7/7. I wrote it down as you were going over your list. Peter Powers went on the BBC that morning after the 7/7 bombing, and he was the one of the head people at a company that was overseeing and running a drill, as he said.
Today we were running an exercise for a company, bearing in mind I'm now in the private sector, and we sat everybody down in the city, 1,000 people involved in the whole organisation, but the crisis team, and the most peculiar thing was we based our scenario on the simultaneous attacks on the underground and mainline station. So we had to suddenly switch an exercise from fictional to real.
So these drills of which you speak are on the record. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Right, and so that's the disturbing thing. Now, we're not coincidence theorists at this point, and in my book I show you the declassified Project SEAL documents from the mid-50s, where New Zealand, United Kingdom, United States were working on the design and fabrication of a tsunami bomb that would create an artificial tsunami and would inundate an opponent's enemy's coastline with salt water. And in the documents, they go on to say this is best tried with a number of atomic charges, because they're doing Bikini Atoll right around the same time or prior to that. So they're saying, look, we'll use atomic charges as well. I also show from the William Cohen interview where he's the Secretary of Defense in 1997, and he says, I'll bring up the quote right here. He talks about eco-terrorism, and he says there are others engaging even in an eco-type of terrorism that can alter the climate, set off earthquakes, volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves. And so with this particular knowledge and the knowledge of this tsunami bomb, you can see that the technology exists if you wanted to. This is entirely possible. And if you look from a statistical probability assessment analysis, we know that the odds, because if you think about having the drill, this was the combined incident response, and they had Japanese utility execs here. Elliot Brenner, head of NRC, Office of Public Affairs, says this is off limits. This topic is off. Don't talk about it to anyone. That they're here and they're using our headquarters during this event. This drill went down in Rockville, Maryland, according to these documents, at the same time. So to get those Japanese people here in the States, arrangements have to be made. You got to fly them in. This combined incident response has to be, I'm thinking many months ahead in preparation and planning. It's not spur of the moment. So the fact it occurred and the same thing happens at the same time, okay, we in this country need to have a very serious discussion about this. And if I could real quick add, I'm in Gainesville, Florida. There's a guy that had a YouTube channel who lived here in Gainesville, Florida. I'm not making this up. The guy's channel, he specialized in the Aurora Batman massacre. He researched that particular drill and that particular event. The guy was not, as I understand, nonviolent and peaceful his whole life. Thomas Brinkley was his YouTube name. He lives here in Gainesville. The other morning, out of the blue, he stabs someone on the University of Florida College campus. They catch him downtown, and he attacks a police officer with a hatchet or an axe, and they had to shoot him. They shot him down in the street. He's dead. And he was researching that Aurora massacre, and this is in my town. And so should be very disturbing and eye-opening we need authorities to look into this, and we need a serious discussion in this country about what this means.
That is very coincidental. That's very disturbing. I do want
There's an article in the Gainesville Sun here. You can look into it. I mean, I'm kind of worried about it myself, to be honest with you. I only want to go so far with Plumegate. I don't do a lot of interviews because if you try to stand out from people, you make yourself a target. I'm hoping people will read the book, engage in the documents, and familiarize themselves with it so they can help me bring this forth to the American public, because I don't want to make a target out of myself at all.
Well, and I want to piggyback on something you were talking about too, as far as a tsunami bomb. I'm not sure how many people have taken a look at this extremely lengthy PDF document from the Air Force, which was written in 1996, and I'm not sure when it became public, but it's the title of it is "Weather as a Force Multiplier: Owning the Weather in 2025." We're a long ways, Hatrick, from 1996 as we sit here in 2014. You can bet that the powers that be have the technologies that they've been working on for so very long, and they are using weather as a weapon. And I'm not sure what happened on March 11th. It just needs to be asked what really went down, though, because, again, it's one of those events that's going to change the face of our planet. And I guess I'm not sure what more we can do or say for people at this point. So I'll throw it back to you to kind of summarize. I think you ought to tell people where they can get your book. It's free. You're not asking anybody to pay you for it. That needs to be said. Your work has really been charitable work on behalf of humanity, and I just want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for all the work you put in.
Well, you can find my document in PDF form. It is 450 pages. The last 15 or 20 are colored plume models you can look at, but you can find it. I have a WordPress blog, Hatrick Penry, and also have HatrickPenryUnbound.com as my website, and of course my YouTube channel, Hatrick Penry. And also, as I've said, I have a distilled form of my book in this abstract. If you don't have a lot of time and you don't want to read 450 pages, the basic thrust of what's in these documents, the most concerning points I've tried to include in that abstract. And it's just been trying to get the word out to the public, and I ask people to assist me. As I said, if you make yourself into a MLK type and out in a Gandhi type, you don't last. But if we all do this together at the same time, it's much more difficult to target any one person, and maybe in that way we can bring awareness, and maybe change will result from a heightened state of awareness from the American public.
Well, that's right, and I think that we can leave this glimmer of hope. If we all recall what happened when the American people rose up together in droves and said hell no to more war and hell no to war in Syria, the powers that be were not able to really foment and start that war. And now, of course, there's all this saber rattling with Russia and Ukraine, and as Ron Paul would say, it's none of our damn business, and this country needs to stay out of it. And I just want to say one last thing in regard to this conversation and any conversations any of us have about these very real and potentially very frightening issues. As long as we all still have the Bill of Rights, as long as we have our First Amendment right to free speech, we will continue to speak out. We will continue to try to speak truth and share truth and uncover truth wherever we can do it. And Hatrick Penry, you're one of those guys on the forefront, certainly as it relates to what went on at Fukushima on March 11th, 2011. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
I appreciate the credit, and it was an honor to be on your program, sir.
It was an honor to have you. You guys, thank you so much for listening, and do check us out at sgtreport.com for real news 24/7. Thanks for watching.